My name is Yurasek, and on behalf of Global Genes, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to this session on negotiating and resolving conflicts, maintaining trust through tough conversations. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. I promise you we're going to have an engaging, interactive session, and really happy to be with you today. Anne, can you take me to the next slide? So just to get us started, I really just want to hear who's in the room with us today. My name is Anne Yurasek, and I am with a consulting firm called FIO Partners. We work with leaders to make better decisions. Primarily, we work in the space of strategic planning for nonprofits. We work on strategic alliances, which is really about how nonprofits come together, and support nonprofits and social sector organizations with research and training. I am based here in Connecticut in the United States, and it is just a pleasure to be with all of you. Don't hesitate to jump into the chat just as we get started and introduce yourselves to the group. Let us know your name, your organization, and really where you're dialing in from this afternoon. I really hope that you've had an engaging conference experience and look forward to being part of that today. Next slide. And so what are we hoping to do today? So really, in terms of this session, this is about exploring, really thinking about how do we resolve conflict? How can we build trust? How can we, in some ways, really work through the sticky parts of what happens when we get into conflict with one another? And so what we're going to hope to do today is really explore strategies around building your own internal clarity. We're going to learn how to build trust across the table during and within challenging conversations. And we're really going to think about how can we identify mutually beneficial goals between parties and next steps. And I really welcome all of you to use the chat, to use the Q&A. The Q&A really is and chat are based on the side of your screen. If you have a question during the session, don't hesitate to drop it into the Q&A. Or if you just like to share a reflection, I really am going to be asking you throughout this session to reflect on conflict in your life, reflect on your own experiences with conflict. So let's use that chat to really share our reflections as we move through the content today. And don't hesitate to jump in with a question, again, using that moderator Q&A. And I'll welcome Jenny and Deb. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, and Sarah as well. And next slide. So before we even get into kind of the content of this session, I want us to kind of put ourselves in a place of reflection. This is a really challenging topic for some people. If I think about sort of conflict in your personal life, conflict in your work life, conflict in your interactions as an organization, as a leader within your organization, for some people, conflict is a really challenging topic to explore. And we're going to get into kind of the why of that. But my hope would be that you really come away from today with a way of thinking about conflict that sort of, in some ways, makes it less difficult, that makes you realize that conflict is something that can be reflected upon, that resolving conflict is something that you can intentionally plan to do, and that in many ways, conflict is a part of advancing our work together. There is no situation that is not going to have some kind of misunderstanding, miscommunication, differing perspectives that are going to come to light. And what we have to be able to do as leaders, as individuals, is recognize that conflict is part of the journey. And so even before we get into this, I just wanted to set that context that building skills to manage, negotiate, and be comfortable with conflict is part of advancing your own work forward, really whatever that may be. So Anne, let's start to get into this. So I want you to think a little bit about how do you define conflict? So as I was preparing for this session, I was remembering a moment that I had with my own parent where my mom actually got on the phone with me and she was speaking in a particular way. And I said, "Stop it, you're yelling at me." And she said, "I'm not yelling." And I experienced the entire exchange as conflict, as something difficult. And what we have to realize is that we need to reflect on conflict and how it shows up in our own lives. What we might perceive as conflict or difficulty and disagreement with someone, the other person may not see it that way at all. And we're going to talk about the why of that. So I want you to reflect really on 3 questions. When I say the word or sentence that you are now in conflict with another party, what does that make you? How does it make you feel? What does that look and feel like to you? Do you have images of someone yelling? Do you have images of someone shutting down? Do you have images of actual emotional or physical violence? This is a tricky topic for a lot of those reasons. I want you to think about, how do you typically feel about conflict? And so if I had to say to you, you're going to turn the corner and engage in conflict with someone, what's your immediate reaction? Are you really sort of afraid to turn that corner, or are you like, bring it, I'm ready to go? And where in your own body do you actually physically experience conflict? I have a colleague who sometimes says, when we're about to get into conflict or there's a difficult thing, my stomach hurts. So we have to realize that conflict is not just this thing that periodically happens, that all of us have a history with conflict for in so many ways, in the ways that it shows up in our lives. And so, Anne, can you go to the next slide? So let's talk a little bit about some of those dynamics. And I've mentioned a few of them already, but we want to think about what's our own personal history with conflict. How does conflict show up in our culture, either in our house, in our organization? There are certainly some organizations that we would say that we don't have conflict. Everyone gets along. Everyone is very polite. And I would say that, yes, conflict mostly happens. It probably happens in the parking lot or in the Zoom private chat in our virtual workplaces. What's the context or environment in some ways for this particular conflict? How are we thinking about it? What's the history in this particular situation? What are the demographics of those that are involved in the conflict? How could that influence how we perceive or think about conflict in our lives? The other piece is, how do you feel about power and power dynamics in terms of conflict and conflicts that you've engaged in either historically or the one that's currently playing out? What are the attitude and responses of others to conflict, or even your own perception of how others will respond? And what are your own personality preferences as it relates to conflict? So what we have to realize that on the personality front, many of us, I would say, may describe ourselves as conflict averse. That you don't run into conflict. When you realize you might have a disagreement with someone, you realize that you've had a misstep, you might be the person that sort of really thinks about it overnight. You take it home with you. You're like, oh gosh, that did not go well. And you perceive re-engagement as actually pretty high stakes or actually an expression of conflict. The tricky part is there's other people in the world that I would say are conflict comfortable. They actually see conflict as a piece of the process to advance work forward or to advance an idea forward. They embrace disagreement. They embrace that dialogue around, let's get our ideas on the table and actually argue about something. For those people that are conflict averse, that even exchange of ideas can feel like conflict. So it's really important for us to recognize that anytime you're dealing with this issue, every player in the mix is bringing their own experiences with conflict to the table. And so what we need to think about, and really the punchline of this in some ways, is the only person that you can control is yourself. So when you find yourself in a situation that you would perceive as conflict, I'm going to encourage you to think about why. Which of these bullets on this slide really resonate with you about your why in terms of how you perceive conflict? The trickiest part of some of this is that personal history with conflict can show up today, whether or not you want it to or not. And so it's really important to be able to separate some of these elements that are on this slide of your own history, your own experiences with conflict, from the potentially kind of present conflict that you might find yourself in. And why don't you take me to the next slide? Well, what are some of the definitions of conflict? And so if we actually, go to the internets, an open clash between two opposing groups or individuals, a disagreement or argument about something important, a state of opposition between persons or ideas or interests. What we have to realize is that we can, in fact, be experiencing conflict, if we think about these 3 bullets, just about every day. we actually all have a lot of experience with conflict. And whether you have pets or children or a partner or a friend or a work colleague, or you're an organization that's seeking to partner with another organization, I can guarantee that 100% of you in today's session have experienced any one of these 3 bullets. You've been in disagreement with someone, you've had an opposing viewpoint, and we've got to find really productive, healthy ways to be able to move from places of conflict and be able to move forward. But I always like to remind people, especially when I'm training on a topic like this, is that I'm not really the expert. All of us are. All of us experience conflict in our lives on a pretty regular basis. And some of that conflict is very low stakes, and some of that conflict is very high stakes. And what we have to be able to do is really pause and understand when conflict unfolds, and intentionally plan for conflict resolution. So Anne, let's go forward with this. So I want you to sort of reflect for a second. I want you to think about, I just want to jump to the chat. Deb just jumped in with really saying, that someone was sort of speaking sharp, and it wasn't conflict. It was actually the way that they were speaking. And I will agree with you, Deb, that is a very normal, and it has definitely happened to me many, many times. So I identify in some ways as conflict averse. And even for me, tone of voice may even trigger my own, and this is what happens with conflict, my own fight or flight response, which is that, oh my gosh, that person is upset with me, when they really might actually be dealing with something else. And we're going to get into that today, that ability to slow ourselves down to try to really understand what's happening in a situation. But here's the thing about conflict. As we've all had so much experience with it, I want you to think about 2 different instances. One, when you experience conflict with someone, another party, another organization, and you were actually really pleased with the resolution of that conflict. You're really pleased with how it worked out. And one that actually you were really disappointed. So just take a second and think about what were the details in those 2 different situations. Think a little bit about what's the why of that. Why in one of those instances did you feel really good about the outcome? And what about the other instance left you disappointed? So part of this is really recognizing that we can use our own experience to take away what works in a high conflict situation and what may not work. So take a second and think about that, and share with me in the chat what might be some of the differences when you think about those experiences between the 2. So just take a second. I will share one story from my own life in the sense of one of the things that conflict resolution requires is communication. And one of the things that we can sometimes find in a relationship where someone is very conflict averse, and this is a situation where I was unpleased with the outcome of a conflict. So I was in a disagreement with a work colleague about something, and it was someone that we'd worked with periodically. And we really had differing points of view, and I really wanted to engage the person in a conversation about those differing points. And instead of being willing to talk me through it, the person literally resigned from the organization. They refused to engage. And so sometimes what we have to recognize is that our disappointment in a resolution is sometimes that someone won't actually resolve it. And so what I want you to think about, though, is that you have definitely had both sides of this experience and really thinking for yourself what was different between the 2. Anne, why don't you take me forward? So what's this mean? So if we know that we can resolve conflict in a positive way, and we know that we can have experiences with conflict that are actually positive, that have a positive outcome, that move the work forward, and we can have these situations where conflict can really go quite badly, where we could lose a relationship, we could lose the possibility of a partnership. We have to, in some ways, wake up our own curiosity. We have to wake up our own visibility to when conflict is either occurring or is on the horizon. And we have to be ready to engage. And so what I'm going to talk about now is kind of a section around how do we actually prepare to engage. And I want to thank Mary for jumping into the chat before I move on. This idea of feeling heard by the other party. Even though we disagreed, we could discuss the why behind our beliefs. And we're going to dig into that today as well. And the worst of times is when people dismiss things. And that's that shut down behavior, is that we believe resolution is possible, but if the other party will not engage with us, we really do leave a situation kind of with a sense of disappointment and a sense of lost opportunity. But let's get into this. And take me to the next slide. So what we're going to do in this section is really explore preparing to engage. And throughout the session, we're going to hit two other topics, which is really how do we manage the conversation itself and how do we move forward. So let's lean into preparing to engage. Next slide in. So one of the things about preparing to engage, I'm going to get into this in just a second, which is around the relationship, is this idea of trust. And what is trust and how does it play out when we're dealing with situations of conflict? So I'm sharing with you a model which speaks to how does trust get created. What we have to realize is the capacity for trust between parties. And you may say, no, while we're talking about trust, we're talking about conflict. The thing about the intersection of these two topics is that we can manage conflict when there is a high degree of trust between the parties. We really can. If we trust that another party, and I'm going to go through each three of these, has a trust of capability. So if I am engaging with someone and I trust that they're going to be able to do the things that they say they can do, so they have the skills, the competency, if they say they're going to kind of write up a report, that person will actually have the skills to be able to do that. That's trust of capability. On the right-hand side is trust of character, which is really trusting that someone is accountable, that they can make agreements and follow through on them. And that's sort of like contractually, can I trust you? And the thing about conflict and why this is important is if you're seeking resolution around a conflict and you schedule a meeting and someone doesn't show up to the meeting, how does that feel? What does that feel like? That is, in fact, the degradation of trust. And so this ability to follow through on agreements is critically important as another element of that trust pie in so many ways. And the last piece of it is the trust of communication. When I am engaging with you, when I'm having dialogue with you, can I actually trust that the things that you say are truthful? That you are in fact speaking the truth and that we in fact are understanding one another. And so what we have to realize, though, is this cycle of trust is built over time. And when we're thinking about conflict, the very first thing that I want you to start to think about is how much do I trust, or how much trust actually exists between the parties that in some ways that have the conflict or the situation. So it's really important to spend some time thinking about that trust piece. And in so many ways, which of these elements are either cultivated in the relationship that you may be experiencing conflict, or where are they actually problematic? And I like to make a small joke here about New England here in the United States, it may be all over the world, where no one forgets anything ever. So the thing about trust is that whether you're an organization or an individual, especially with organizations, oftentimes people will say, well, we don't trust that other organization because of something that happened in 1972 that someone remembers as a representation whether or not we can trust them or not. And so what we have to realize is trust is built over time, and it has these various elements. And this gives us a little bit of a backdrop for beginning to think about the relationships involved in the conflict itself. Let me jump over to the chat just real quickly. Deb also shared the hard for me to get my board on the same page. Absolutely, that is a very common nonprofit challenge. Happy to chat about that if we need to. And in terms of someone's state of mind, and let's get into that, because I think in so many ways that's going to be where we manage the conversation. So, Anne, take me to the next slide. And so let's shift over to really understanding the relationship. And you can jump right over to those bullets. So there's a couple of key themes that I really want you to take away today. And one of them is intentionality. And the first piece of intentionality is when you're engaging in a situation with someone is to really just pause. To pause and create some time to say, before I attempt to resolve this conflict or this issue. Because when we're in it, sometimes conflict can sort of spin out of control and it can keep going. And the best thing that you can do when you sort of run into a conflict with someone or a disagreement or a challenge is create the space and time to have some intentionality to try to look at the situation with objective eyes. And so the first set of questions I want you to explore is, what is the relationship that I currently have or my organization has with either this individual or another organization? Is this an individual relationship? Is it organizational? Is it not defined? Is this a new relationship, or is there a long history? One of the things with organizational relationships that's tricky is that oftentimes the players change. And so we have to sort of say to ourselves, are these new players that are involved in this collaborative or this partnership, or are these the people we've been working with, for a really long time? Is this a professional conflict, or is it real personal, or is it actually both? And that's important for you to reflect on, and we'll get to why in a second. And what's the typical dynamic? So has this relationship been kind of high conflict all along? We disagree all the time, and it's really either not that big of a deal or not anything that's really of a concern to us. We actually kind of have conflict and negotiate, and we're all able to do that with sort of healthy dynamics and a healthy relationship, and it's just par for the course. Or is this actually a real change in behavior or a change in positioning? And this particularly occurs with organizations. We're an organization that may be a very close partner for a period of time. There can be a shift in players, and thereby some very different perspectives and conflict can emerge at that point. And then the other thing I want you to think about is types of communication. So where and how do you typically communicate with this particular individual? What do you see as the best modes of communication with this particular party? And has there been a shift? So oftentimes in a high conflict situation, sometimes parties that have been talking to one another all of a sudden substantively change and start writing really, really long, detailed emails. That's like a yellow light in terms of conflict that says something has changed or shifted, where people are feeling an increasing obligation to document conversations. And it's a slow down sign, because it may mean that in some ways trust has been impacted in some way, and that is definitively worthy of exploration. So the first piece is this piece around really thinking about who are the players in this particular conflict, what is the relationship, and more importantly, the one last piece I want you to think about in terms of the relationship is, do you want to have a relationship with this person going forward? There are some conflicts that may be a new partner, someone you don't know well, an organization that's more allied to your work versus, integral to your work. And we run into conflict. And as we think about intentionally addressing it, one of the things I really encourage us to do is ask ourselves, is this worth it? Is engaging in the resolution of the conflict worth it? And we're going to need to, in some ways, be clear that it is worth it to engage the time, energy, and resources that it often takes to resolve conflict. And so this intentionality about thinking about who is the conflict with, and what are my aspirations for this relationship? If this is a short-term relationship, it's a transactional relationship, you could move on to another party if this person is high conflict and you're disagreeing on key points. I might say that this conflict may not be worth resolving. But if this is a long-term partner, there clearly has been something that's gone awry, and you're willing to invest the time, that's also a really important clarity to have before you begin to engage. And why don't you take me to the next slide? So the other thing that we need to do is not only understand the relationship, is we have to spend some time analyzing the issue itself. What is this conflict related to? And more importantly, how does it make you feel, or what is the emotional content of those that are engaging in the particular issue or engaging in the negotiation process? Where is everyone's emotional content? So you're going to have in this conflict resolution process, both cognitive content, which is the content of the conflict. So I'll use an example. We typically, in our work, negotiate strategic alliances between nonprofits. And we're recently doing a merger negotiation between two entities. They felt very strongly, one party felt very strongly about, and this may resonate with all of you today, sort of consumer involvement at the board level. The other party really, in some ways, it's not that they disagreed, but they had, how shall I put it, a different perspective on how that should play out at the board level. And there was the content of that. We were talking about specific board seats. We were specifically talking about the numbers of seats that people would get in the merger process. The tricky part is that we had individuals at the negotiating table who had a very strong commitment to that philosophy. Their why was very powerful. And their emotional content and dedication to the cause of client-centered decision-making in this particular organization came through powerfully, passionately. They felt very strongly about this issue. It was based in their own experience, the experience of others. The tricky part is when you're trying to talk about the numbers of seats, but you've got someone else talking about their why, you need to be able to understand that that is a recipe somewhat for disaster. You have someone who's coming in some ways maybe not able to manage their own emotional content around a topic, and you have other people who are really focused on the cognitive content and are like, we really just want 6 seats. So I want you to kind of recognize that in any conflict, there's both the cognitive content of the disagreement, and then there is the emotional content. And when we're thinking about a situation that you might need to manage or a conflict that you're seeking to resolve, I need you individually to reflect on what is the cognitive content, what is the actual key message that I want to convey, the information that may not be understood, what my desired outcome for this, versus how am I feeling about this. And what you have to realize is that in every single situation, there will be differences between those emotional and cognitive content. You will have certain situations where the emotional content is through the roof, and you will have others where the emotional content is really, really low. And so what I want you to think about is, how does that play out in the conflict itself? If you're in a situation where you have very high emotional content, you are very emotional. Are you able to hear someone else's cognitive message? And the reality is no. And so what we have to be able to understand before engaging is that if there is very high emotional content for you, for your organization, before engaging in resolution, you've got to think about how do you manage that emotional content in the process. Because that emotional content can absolutely, in some ways, override or overrun the exchange of cognitive ideas. And so we also have to realize that in some cases, people may really view this kind of resolution and engagement as very risky. So they come into these situations, as I would say, kind of emotionally heightened. Some people are concerned about putting a relationship in jeopardy and saying, you know, it's not worth it. I'm not ready to do this. We all have a lot going on in our lives. Oh, you know, hashtag global pandemic. I also think that in a lot of ways, everything may have more emotional content right now. So how do we be aware of that and figure out how it plays out in this process? And lastly, you know, we really have to feel confident in our own ability to engage in the conversation. So if you reflect on a situation and you say to yourself, you know what, I have a lot of emotional content around this that I'm going to need to really think about before I engage in a conversation. And I want you to think about what about it resonates with you from an emotional perspective. Are there other outlets that you can use to kind of vent or write everything down that you need to say, you know, to kind of move beyond the emotional content and be able to engage. The emotional content can serve a purpose, but I tend to find that it keeps us from being able to hear one another in this work. Great. And so what I want you just to do is, and we don't need to use the chat for this, this is really an individual exercise, but just really think about those two other situations that you identified earlier. And think about this role, or kind of how did the emotional and cognitive content play out in those two different situations, and think about that content as it relates to the actual outcomes in the conflict. So oftentimes when the emotional content is very high, resolution tends to be much more difficult. And when we can figure out how to work through the emotional content, focus on cognitive exchange, focus on really addressing the root causes or issues of the conflict in a way that people can hear each other, we can have a more successful outcome. So Anne, you can take me forward. So we've talked about, in some ways, the relationship. We've talked about the content of the issue. And then the other piece that I want you to think about before engagement is really your own internal clarity about what you want and why you want it. And again, this comes back to my question, is this worth it? And so when we think about positions, and so this is where we sort of start to overlay conflict, which is that perceived disagreement, with, in some ways, core skills of negotiation, which is how do we get to resolution? And in negotiation, what you have to be clear about before you go to the table is, what do you want? You know, what are the kind of very specific outcomes, things you would like to see happen, the cognitive content in some ways of the issue, and why do you want it? And someone shared this in the chat. We've got to be clear about the beliefs that sit behind our positions. And so let's go back to my board merger example, which really speaks to this idea of just board seats. We're bringing together two organizations. Who gets what seats? How many seats do they get? How do we decide that? And so we had to have conversations about what is the value that we hold as it relates to sharing power with clients at the board level. And do both organizations agree with that belief? We had to build sort of shared ownership for the why in order to get to the what. But what I encouraged both parties to do before even coming to the table was to write down their positions and interests for themselves. Because what we're able to do is in some ways lean into our whys first and then get to the positions. But you've got to do this work on your own first. So that's why it's here in preparing to engage. If you've decided to move forward with resolution, you've got to spend the time knowing your own positions and your own interests. And that's a critical first step. And Hirad jumps in with a question about managing conflict virtually versus in person, and how can this make a difference as we work through the conflict. In many cases, in this moment in time, you may not have a different option. But I would say this, it's a lot about the relationship. It's a lot about the modes of communication. You also can work with the other party to say, under what circumstances should we have this conversation? And we're going to get into that in the sense of when we're thinking about what we want to convey, we're thinking about what resolution looks like. We also have to start to be thinking about the conversation itself. So we're going to come back around to that. I think if I'll say a 2 cents here is I think we have to be able to manage conflict both in person and virtually. I think in our current work environment and the ongoing issues related to the global pandemic, you are better off figuring out how to resolve something virtually than letting it really fester until we're in person again. And so we can talk about that more in the Q&A and when we talk about managing the conversation. Thanks so much for that. Hey, Anne, why don't you take me to the next slide? So not only do I want you to think about your positions and interests, ultimately, I want you to think about what does success look like? What does the resolution of this conflict mean to you? And it's so important that you spend time here because oftentimes we move into conflict resolution, we get into that conversation, and then we just get to this place and it doesn't feel done. It doesn't feel finished. We've talked at each other. Maybe we've made a tiny bit of progress, but I want you to be clear about what success looks like, and here's why. Your vision of success sets the platform for the conversation. So people need to convey, and parties need to convey, an invitation to the table. They need to feel as if the relationship matters enough to engage in what may be a difficult conversation. So in the invitation to this engagement, to this dialogue, to this opportunity for resolution, I want you to be clear what you're saying to the other party. So if success for you is you are a valued partner of our organization. We have worked together for 10 years. We have come to kind of a point in the road on this particular issue. It would be my aspiration that we can resolve this issue and come to agreed upon next steps, that we can continue to strengthen our relationship through dialogue, that we can use this opportunity as a way to learn more about each other and advance our shared interests. There may be others, but your ability to say to someone, I want you to seek to resolve this conflict with me because I have this vision for where we can go together. I want you to think about the difference between that kind of invitation and an invitation that says, I need to talk to you about this. Completely different. The affect is different. The aspiration is different. Someone is not being called to the table. You are literally saying, I'm inviting you to have a conversation about this challenging thing because I believe that either this is important to both of us. I believe that we would agree that this is a stumbling block where we're stuck. Part of this is really being able to articulate your own vision for where this can go in that opening invitation. You are setting the table to rebuild or strengthen trust. And so in the invitation, being clear in your own mind and then conveying it to the other party is critically important. Because what it also gives you is the metrics to know, in fact, if the resolution is successful. If you're able to work through it and you understand the other party better, if you're able to work through it and you both come away from it feeling excited, engaged, ready to move forward, that's what success is. But that's a critical part of really getting ready to engage. All right, Anne, take me forward. And so how do we prepare for the conversation? I'm just going to hit a couple of high points here. I want you to clarify your key messages. What are your relational aspirations? What do we understand about the issue? Are you clear about your own interests and positions? And how would you describe your vision for success? As you think about preparing for the conversation, think about the invitation, the timing, who needs to be in the room. I think here raises the issue around location, virtual or in person. In some cases, I'm seeing people also prefer just a conference call with no video. Let's not get distracted by our facial expressions. Just call someone and have a conversation. What a novel idea. I want you to manage distractions and make sure you've got all the right people at the party. And take me to the next slide. And so we're setting the table, and now we're in the conversation. So we have engaged, we have invited parties to begin to work on this conflict resolution. And this is about how do we use the conversation itself to build trust and build mutual benefit. So Anne, you can just take me forward pretty quickly through this one. So this is about managing the conversation, and the next one. And so there are two key values that I want you to hold when you are engaging in tough conversations that have an element of conflict, disagreement, or opposing viewpoints. The first is empathy, and the second is inquiry. When you think about empathy, I want you to realize, and this is where empathy and inquiry come together, I also want you to be curious about how are people showing up in this engagement. I want you to realize that when someone comes on a Zoom call, you have absolutely no idea what has happened in their lives in the hour before, the 24 hours before, the week before, the month before. Our ability to understand each other, particularly in a virtual environment, is very low. Even in person, this can happen. So I want you to bring empathy to the conversation, and I want you to bring inquiry. The power of this work in successful conflict resolution is the ability to ask incredible questions that help you better understand someone's positions and someone's interests. And why don't you take me forward? And so what we have to do, as I was sort of laying out, is really at the front end of these conversations, acknowledge the status of the relationship. Is this new? Is this old? What's your hope for the future? Why have you chosen to sit with this person and seek to resolve this conflict? It's got to be anchored in your own why in terms of this relationship being important to you. I want you to start to convey and explain in some ways what you see as your shared interests. So you've done your work around your interests. Your why is this important to you? Why in so many ways is coming to the table to address this issue important to you? What are the values that you're holding in so many ways that are sitting behind your desire for this conflict to be resolved? Next slide, Anne. I want you to think about really engaging with the other party and saying, what's your why? Let's look at our two whys together and think about, where do we have shared interests? What is important to both of us about this issue? I want you to explore, what is the successful outcome that both of you would like to see? At a high level, do your best to stay away from positions in kind of these first two phases around talking about interests and talking about aspirations. Sometimes in the dialogue, you may need to pause, consider that your first conversation, come back to it, look at it together before you try to actually engage and resolve the actual mechanics of the positions, before you try to resolve the actual cognitive content or the kind of the point of contention, as it were. Spending time on shared interests and aspirations will only serve you to better understand why someone may have a position, and actually to build new ideas or new positions together that are based on those shared interests and aspirations. And you can take me forward. And again, what I want you to realize is you've got to monitor the emotional content of all parties and not hesitate to bring the conversation to a close if emotions are high. No one says anything. Most people say something they regret when emotions are high. And what we want you to do is use inquiry to develop deeper understanding, and if not, resolution. You can ask questions like, help me understand your interests. Help me understand the beliefs that are sitting behind that idea. What's important to you? You can acknowledge that you don't know what has happened in their organization or around this issue. You can use questions like, I don't understand what occurred. Help fill in the blanks for me. Is there anything else I should know? Am I reading this situation incorrectly? Is there something that's happened that I should be aware of? Part of this is really getting the other party to talk about, here's why our position is what it is. And it might be information that you don't have. It might be a belief that you were not aware of. But we've got to use inquiry as the strategy to get to deeper understanding. And so what my hope is that when you're in this conversation, and I'm going to go to the Q&A here, I just sort of asked a question about being in the conversation. Are there certain words that we should be cautious about when negotiating conflict? Think about the rules of engagement. Think about the types of behaviors in conversations that you would experience as problematic. I'll use name calling as an example. If someone starts to name call in a conflict, and you aren't comfortable with name calling, that's not a norm that you are comfortable with or your organization is, you just end it. You just say, clearly we need to step back from this. We will schedule a follow-up call to continue the conversation. Or you can have some conversations at the front end about how do we want to treat each other in these conversations. And so it may not be a specific word. Those words could be triggers. There could be thousands of words that could be problematic in any particular negotiation or hopes for resolution. But I think having some conversations with other parties at the front end, it can be really, really helpful. And Carol said, it looks like the conflict can't be resolved. What's the best approach to use if you need to end the relationship with the other party involved? I will be candid, Carol. There are often times, and I think that we raised up a couple examples where people may refuse to engage and really refuse to bring the conflict to resolution. And the separation of the two parties is really the only answer. It is at times unfortunate, and what we often do, so we see this a lot if two organizations come together to merge and ultimately choose not to. Oftentimes, if there is almost like a separation agreement between the two entities to not candidly speak ill of each other in public, where they actually develop, in this instance, kind of a set of talking points for the press or for internal and external stakeholders that say that the talks have come to an end, and they have chosen not to proceed. And so it's really about making sure that if the process is to end the relationship, that there's some agreements around the messaging of the end of that relationship, and seeking to come to agreement around who owns that messaging. So thanks for that, Carol. Anne, you can take me to the next slide. And so in terms of moving forward, before I actually do that, Deb had one more question about managing emotions. One of the best things that you can do, and this is a strategy that I've seen used before, there's something called a pie letter. And a pie letter is something that's called a perceived injurious experience. If you are in conflict with someone where you actually feel as if you've been injured, that you actually have been harmed by this particular party, and you need to figure out how to manage the emotional content, part of this is writing it down to start with yourself. It's called a pie letter. And it is about outlining what happened in the situation, the harm that you experienced, and your own desired resolution for the issue. And so we can manage our own emotions if we feel like they've been expressed in some venue. And sometimes expressing the emotions to the actual party is not in the best interest of your desired outcome. So you've got to find, kind of a side way. I used to say that sometimes talking to your work colleagues is not a great idea. Talking to your pet is an awesome strategy for managing emotional content. Your pet will love you no matter what you say. But it is about how do you make sure that your emotions are in a reasonable place so that you can actually have that dialogue. And sometimes people write a pie letter and then, in fact, A, don't send it, and B, decide that negotiating or resolving that conflict may not be worth it. And so that pie letter process of reflection about what happened, how you were harmed, what you'd like to see happen, can be a pretty cathartic way to figure out, is resolution even possible with this particular party? But how do we move forward? I'm just going to kind of take us through one more slide and then kind of open this up for some more Q&A. And so when we think about moving forward, you can go forward one more. It's really throughout the process of conflict resolution. So two things. Number one, I'm not a magician and neither are you. This kind of resolution cannot usually happen in one conversation, particularly if it's of high substance and high stakes. And so what you want to do, though, is create a pattern of dialogue, of having a conversation, picking off one piece of this. Like, let's just start talking about our values. Before we get into the conflict that we found ourselves in, what's really important to us as it relates to this issue? Capturing the themes from those discussions, reflecting them back at each other, using reflective listening by using writing to say, this is what I think we talked about. Is this what we talked about? Did I miss anything? Google Docs are awesome this way. You can use notes and you can take notes together. You can edit them together. I know that sounds maybe really basic, but it's a great way to say, did I hear what you said correctly? Did we come to the same conclusion? And often when people do see something they're writing, they're like, no, that's not what I said. I meant this. And so great. So creating a dialogue, really in so many ways, validating any key decisions or outcomes that came from those dialogues and committing to next steps. again, the likelihood of resolution is low when it's a high stakes issue. So you're going to need to invest the time to say, this is our first conversation to get to agreement on this issue. And I'm looking forward to kind of our next conversation. Because what you might surface in conversation to conversation is those moments where someone says, well, I feel this way because of this report that I read. And the other party goes, I haven't seen that report. That's not something I'm familiar with. They're like, oh, well, let me send you the report and then we'll talk about it more at our next meeting. So sometimes conflict and disagreement has to do with lack of communication and lack of understanding. And so again, making kind of sometimes conflict resolution, not a one-time only, but actually a process by which you are communicating, sharing information, again, managing that emotional content, reminding yourself of what you're hoping to achieve, and really thinking about it as a process and not a moment in time. So I'm going to kind of wrap it right there. We've got about 10 minutes for some more Q&A, and I love sort of some of the questions that have come up already, but really want to welcome everyone to kind of jump in with any other questions that you might have. I think these issues of conflict and disagreement really can show up in so many aspects of our lives that I'm really happy to tackle. If you've got a challenge or something you're facing that you'd like to raise up in today's session, I'm happy to kind of give it a run around and see if we can't be helpful to you. And thanks so much for your kind notes in the chat. Lots of people said that this was really helpful. Great. So one of the questions that came through the chat is, how do you feel that there's a power imbalance at the table? So one of the things I think about with power imbalances is they can happen in any number of ways. This can be between you and a supervisor, conflict between a board and a CEO. There can be kind of the big player in the partnership and the smaller player in the partnership. And part of it is to acknowledge the power dynamic right from the beginning and acknowledge and have a conversation about the fact that that power dynamic makes this situation either more difficult to resolve or in some ways is at play. And so what we want to have is, the worst thing we can have is power dynamics that we're not talking about. The better thing that we can do. So if I think about a large organization and a small organization, I want the small organization to say out loud, we recognize that you are a giant organization and that we might be a very small part of our work, but our work is very important to us. And it's important for us to feel valued and appreciated in this dialogue. And that's how you can show it to us. So I think power imbalances need to be called out. And I think we need to, especially if you in some ways perceive yourself as having less power, it's really about calling that out and saying, I am in this conversation, recognizing that you may have more power in this dynamic, but at the same time, I really want to move progress or move forward on this particular issue that I'm experiencing. Another question that has come up is this idea about how would we sort of approach these issues as it relates to inter-organizational partnerships and collaborations, monitoring conflict between individuals or groups in a community. What I want us to keep thinking about is, no matter who the players are, we need to know a couple of things. Who are the negotiators? So who are the voices that are at the table for the discussion and ideally resolution of the conflict? And so the first piece is who's at the table. The second piece is what are the relationships between those people and players? And I think everyone would agree is conflict is more easily resolved when we know each other. So when we're in very new relationships and we find ourselves in disagreements, I will very much tell you that it is really difficult to resolve conflict with people you don't know or that you don't have any social cohesion or connection with. I always say it is 10 times more likely that someone will behave badly if they don't know you. And so making sure that you're investing the time, even in virtual meetings, I know this sounds so silly, to do icebreakers, spend time talking about things that are unrelated to the conflict, unrelated to the issue at hand. Get to know each other, and what you believe as individuals or as organizations can be some of the glue that helps you get through potentially some of these tricky parts. So a couple other questions in the mod panel around someone who refuses to negotiate when you have to work with them. So this is the other piece about conflict resolution that I think is really important. You can only control you. You cannot control the other party. You may have a deep interest in negotiating and come to resolution. The other party may not. It is up to you to choose how you proceed. And so in some instances, it may mean ending the relationship. In some ways, it means if you must work with this person, I really encourage people to say, what would actually be a motivating factor for the other person? How is the other person impacted? And then the last question that came through the chat is an agreement about how to handle conflicts in our bylaws or how to handle them. So one of the things that I really like to see, and it's less about actual bylaws of an organization, but actually like board policies or an employee policy handbook that can provide some guidelines around how conflicts could or should be resolved. Oftentimes we encourage a norm which says, we try to work conflict out among the parties for whom they are experiencing the conflict. But we often need another strategy. And so I've seen at the board level the use of an ombudsman. I'm actually a board member who's identified as an ombudsman to help negotiate conflicts. In collaboratives, we often will see an entire section around kind of operating guidelines for nonprofit collaboratives around how in some ways can we resolve conflict using either our leadership structure to help resolve it with, again, a norm in the hopes that parties can actually resolve conflicts on their own. And so hopefully, Deb, that's helpful. I don't usually see it show up in bylaws, but I do usually see it show up in a bunch of other, what I would say are kind of governing documents or tools that nonprofits can use. Great question. Other additional resources. So a couple of tips that I would make, things that I felt helpful in this work. There's an incredible book called Humble Inquiry that is by, I'm blanking on the author, but I'll get it to Anne to share with you. Humble Inquiry is all about using empathy and inquiry to drive deeper understanding and really using questions strategically to advance conversations. And I think as I think about high degrees of conflict between parties, when we're asking each other questions to seek deeper understanding, in so many ways we're forced to really answer those questions on our own, but really get to know and better understand the other party, to understand their position. We may disagree with a position, we may disagree with an interest, but ultimately we can understand their position. And so Humble Inquiry is a fantastic resource for getting you thinking about the power of questions in negotiating conflict. And then I think the other resources really are thinking about negotiation. There's a great book called Getting to Yes, which is really one of the introductory books around how do I negotiate with another party. And I really do think oftentimes that which we see as conflict is actually negotiation. So Getting to Yes and really tools around negotiation, I think can also be really helpful to people. I think what I'd like to just sort of leave you with, the chat's been awesome. Really, thank you so much for jumping in there. The pie letters, that's great. Final thoughts to kind of close out this session. I'm going to come back to a word I used at the beginning, which is intentionality. Often we come to a conflict on the fly. We're fired up, we're angry, we're not even clear thinkers. And if I had something to leave you with today, it's slow down. Slow down and really ask yourself, how much does this relationship matter to you? And if it matters, slow down and plan for this conversation. Plan for a thoughtful exchange, invite someone to a table, seek to build trust and deeper understanding, and really allow the solution to the conflict to emerge over a period of time. Try not to rush it. Try not to come to the table with all of your emotional content around this issue, and think about intentionality. Because I think if we can be intentional as we think about conflict, we can really come to better outcomes. So I am very grateful to all of you. It's wonderful to meet you. Please stay in touch. And really happy to have been here this afternoon. I hope you found this helpful.